Salesperson discriminates against Marla Maples in jewelry store, didn't know she was Trump's ex. The morning started like any other for Marla Maples. She woke up in her Upper East Side apartment, the one she'd kept after all these years because it felt like home, even if it wasn't as grand as some might expect. The windows faced east, and the January sun painted stripes across her bedroom floor. She'd learned to find beauty in these simple moments. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter, Tiffany. "Love you, Mom, and call you tonight?" Marla smiled, typing back quickly. "Can't wait, miss you, baby girl." At 59, Marla had settled into a routine that felt comfortable, if not exactly what people might expect from Donald Trump's ex-wife. She made her own coffee instead of ordering out, did her own laundry, and tried to live as normal a life as anyone could after having been thrust into the spotlight decades ago. She got dressed carefully that morning. A cream-colored cashmere sweater, well-fitted jeans, and boots that were practical for the winter streets, but still elegant. Her makeup was subtle, practiced over years of knowing cameras might catch her at any moment. She'd learned to armor herself this way, to present a polished exterior that people couldn't easily criticize. "Morning, Mrs. Maples," called Jerry, her doorman, as she stepped into the lobby. He'd been there for 15 years and was one of the few people who treated her exactly the same no matter what the tabloids were saying. "Jerry, how many times do I have to tell you to call me Marla?" She smiled warmly at him. "How's Katie doing with the college applications?" His face lit up. "She got into NYU yesterday. Early decision." "That's wonderful!" Marla clasped his hands in genuine excitement. "Tell her congratulations from me. She worked so hard for this." "Will do, Marla. You heading out for the day?" "Just some shopping. Maybe treat myself a little." She adjusted her bag on her shoulder. It was Louis Vuitton, but from several seasons ago. She'd never been one to throw things away just because they weren't the latest model. The winter air hit her face as she stepped outside, and she pulled her scarf tighter. Madison Avenue stretched before her, the sidewalks already filling with the usual mix of power-suited professionals, tourists clutching shopping bags, and locals going about their day. She stopped at her usual coffee cart, where Mohammed had her order memorized. "The usual, Miss Maples? Green tea, honey on the side?" "You're the best, Mohammed. How's the baby sleeping?" He laughed, preparing her drink. "Finally through the night, my wife says it's a miracle." These were the interactions she treasured most. Simple, human moments where she wasn't Trump's ex or that woman or any of the other labels that had been stuck to her over the years. As she walked, sipping her tea, she passed the windows of Bergdorf's, Barney's, and all the other high-end stores that had once been such a regular part of her life. Now, she shopped more carefully, more thoughtfully. The money from the divorce settlement had been invested wisely, but she'd learned the value of moderation. She paused outside Cartwright and Son's Fine Jewelry, studying her reflection in the window. The store had been there for decades, a family business that had managed to survive in an era of luxury conglomerates. Through the glass, she could see the gleaming cases, the subtle lighting that made everything sparkle just so. A young couple was inside, clearly shopping for engagement rings. The girl's face was glowing with excitement, while her boyfriend looked simultaneously terrified and thrilled. Marla smiled, remembering that feeling of new love, of believing in forever. "It's not about the size of the ring," she wanted to tell them. "It's about what's in your hearts." But of course that would sound ridiculous coming from her. Everyone knew about the 7.45-carat Harry Winston that Donald had given her. The ring that had made headlines, that had been photographed and analyzed and judged, just like everything else about their relationship. She watched as an older woman in the store, probably the young man's mother, pointed to something in one of the cases. There was something so normal, so wholesome about the scene, that it made her chest ache a little. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. The familiar bell chimed above her head, and the scent of leather and polish enveloped her. This was a smell she associated with happier times, celebrating anniversaries, buying gifts for friends, marking special occasions. The young couple was just leaving, the girl clutching her boyfriend's arm and whispering excitedly. They barely glanced at Marla as they passed, wrapped up in their own joy. She remembered that too, being so in love that the rest of the world faded away. The store was quiet now, just the soft classical music playing through hidden speakers and the gentle hum of the climate control system keeping the jewelry at the perfect temperature. Behind the counter, a woman in her early 30s was rearranging something in one of the cases. Her nameplate read, Sandra Chen, Sales Associate. Sandra glanced up briefly, taking in Marla's appearance with a quick, professional assessment. Marla recognized that look. She'd been on both sides of it. The subtle cataloging of clothes, accessories, the way someone carried themselves. In the world of luxury retail, these quick judgments were everything. "Good morning," Marla said warmly, approaching the counter. She'd learned over the years that kindness was the best defense against prejudice. Sandra straightened up, and Marla caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in posture that said, "This woman isn't worth my full attention. Can I help you?" Sandra's voice had that particular tone that every New Yorker recognized, professional enough to avoid complaint, but cool enough to establish boundaries. Marla ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the glass case, looking at the pieces displayed inside. Each one was beautiful, carefully chosen and perfectly positioned. A pair of pearl earrings caught her eye. Classic, elegant, the kind of piece that never went out of style. "I'm looking for something special," she said, still studying the case. "A pendant, maybe. Something elegant but not too flashy." She looked up at Sandra with a smile. "Sometimes the simplest pieces make the biggest statement, don't you think?" Sandra's expression didn't warm. "We have some lovely pieces in this case that might be suitable." She gestured to a display of lower-priced items near the end of the counter. "These are our more accessible options." The word accessible hit like a slap, though Marla kept her smile in place. She'd developed this skill over decades, maintaining composure when people tried to put her in her place. "Actually," Marla said gently, "I was thinking of something more along the lines of that sapphire pendant." She pointed to a stunning piece in the central display case. "The way the diamonds frame the center stone is quite beautiful." Sandra's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "That piece is $68,000. She said it like a challenge, like a door being closed. Marla had heard that tone countless times over the years, in restaurants when she asked for a better table, in stores when she browsed the designer sections, in hotels when she requested an upgrade. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," Marla said, refusing to be baited. "Is it from your estate collection?" Sandra's eyebrows lifted slightly, surprised that this woman, whom she'd already dismissed as another wannabe socialite, knew enough to recognize estate jewelry. "No," she replied, her tone still cool. "It's a new piece, but inspired by Art Deco designs. We have some more commercial pieces over here that might be more appropriate for what you're looking for." There it was again, that subtle pushing, that gentle but firm herding toward the less expensive items. Marla felt a familiar heaviness in her chest. After all these years, it could still hurt to be judged, to be found wanting by someone who didn't know the first thing about her. She thought about leaving. It would be easier to walk out, to shop somewhere else, to avoid the discomfort of this interaction. But something made her stay. Perhaps the same something that had helped her survive years of public scrutiny and criticism. "You know," Marla said, keeping her voice gentle, "I've always believed that jewelry is about more than its price tag. Each piece tells a story. Like this one." She pointed to a vintage gold locket. "Someone wore this, loved it, passed it down. It probably held pictures of children or sweethearts. That's what makes it precious, don't you think?" Sandra's response was a non-committal, "Mm-hmm," as she busied herself with straightening an already perfectly arranged display. The door chimed again as an elderly woman entered the store. Sandra's entire demeanor changed instantly. Her posture straightened, her smile became genuine. Her eyes lit up with professional interest. The woman was wearing a Chanel suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Mrs. Ashworth, how lovely to see you again. How was Gustad?" Marla watched the interaction with a mix of amusement and resignation. She'd been on both sides of this equation too, the valued customer and the overlooked one. As Sandra fawned over Mrs. Ashworth, Marla continued to browse, moving slowly along the cases. Each piece was exquisite, carefully chosen, and perfectly displayed. She paused at a case containing tennis bracelets, remembering the one Donald had given her for their first anniversary. She'd sold it years ago and donated the money to a domestic violence shelter. Some memories were better transformed into something positive. "I'll be with you in just a moment," Sandra called over to her, the dismissal clear in her tone. "Take your time," Marla replied warmly. "I'm enjoying looking." She could hear snippets of Sandra's conversation with Mrs. Ashworth. Talk of ski trips and grandchildren and upcoming charity galas. The easy familiarity of people who moved in the same social circles, who understood each other's worlds. Marla remembered when she had been part of that world. When doors had opened automatically, when sales associates had competed for her attention, when her opinion had mattered at charity board meetings and social functions. She didn't miss it, not really. But sometimes she missed being treated like she belonged. Finally, Mrs. Ashworth left with a small, elegantly wrapped package, and Sandra turned her attention back to Marla. Her expression had already shifted back to one of polite dismissal. "Now, about those pieces I was showing you earlier," Sandra began. "Actually," Marla said, "I'd like to look at that sapphire pendant again, the Art Deco-inspired piece." Sandra's smile became tight. "As I mentioned, that piece is quite expensive. Perhaps we could look at something more realistic for your situation." The words hung in the air between them. Marla felt that familiar tightening in her throat, the one that came with being judged and dismissed. But before she could respond, a male voice came from the direction of the back office. "Is that Marla Maples I hear out there?" And suddenly, everything was about to change. Harold Cartwright III emerged from his office, his face breaking into a genuine smile of recognition. He was older than Marla remembered. His hair had gone completely silver, and there were more lines around his eyes. But he still had that same gracious manner she recalled from years ago. "Miss Maples, what an absolute delight!" He moved forward with his hand extended. "It's been, 5 years? 6? Sandra's expression shifted from dismissive to confused, then to horrified understanding, as she watched her boss greet this woman she'd been condescending to for the past 20 minutes. "Harold," Marla smiled warmly, taking his offered hand. "It's wonderful to see you, and yes, I think it was at the Children's Hospital benefit. You donated that beautiful emerald suite for the auction." "That's right, and you helped drive the bidding up. We raised almost twice what we expected that night." He gestured toward the sapphire pendant she'd been admiring. "I see you still have excellent taste. That piece would look stunning with your coloring." Sandra stood frozen behind the counter, her face growing increasingly pale as the conversation continued. She began to fidget with her bracelet, a nervous habit that betrayed her growing discomfort. "You know," Harold continued, "every time I see a significant emerald piece, I think of that custom necklace we designed for Tiffany's graduation. How is your daughter?" "She's wonderful. Thank you for asking. Actually just finished law school." Marla's voice filled with maternal pride. "Still wearing that necklace for special occasions." "Of course she is. It was designed to become an heirloom." Harold turned slightly toward Sandra, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. "Sandra, would you mind bringing out the sapphire pendant Miss Maples was interested in? And perhaps the matching earrings from the safe?" Sandra's, "Yes, Mr. Cartwright," came out as barely more than a whisper. Her hands trembled slightly as she removed the pendant from the display case. "I remember when you first opened this location," Marla said conversationally, watching Sandra struggle with the keys to the safe. "Must be, 25 years ago now?" 27 next month, Harold confirmed. "You were one of our first major clients here. That ruby and diamond bracelet for your anniversary." He trailed off, suddenly remembering that perhaps references to her marriage weren't the most tactful choice. But Marla just smiled, used to navigating these awkward moments. "Life takes unexpected turns, doesn't it?" she said softly. "But some things stay the same, like your eye for exceptional pieces." Sandra returned with the jewelry, laying out the sapphire pendant and matching earrings on a black velvet display pad. Her movements were mechanical, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Would you like to try them on?" Harold asked, though it wasn't really a question. He was already reaching for the pendant. Marla touched the sapphire gently. It was truly beautiful, the kind of piece that would make any woman feel special. But something had shifted in the air, and the joy of the moment had been tainted by the earlier interaction. "You know," she said quietly, "I think I need some time to think about it. Jewelry is such a personal choice, isn't it? You have to be in exactly the right frame of mind." Harold's face showed understanding. He'd been in the business long enough to read between the lines. Of course, of course. Please know that you're always welcome here, Miss Maples. Always. The emphasis on always was subtle but clear. A message meant as much for Sandra as for Marla. Sandra stood rigid behind the counter, her face a mask of professional neutrality barely concealing her mortification. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. Marla gathered her bag, preparing to leave. But before she did, she turned to Sandra with a gentle smile. Thank you for your help today. Sometimes it's good to be reminded that appearances can be deceiving. The words weren't delivered with malice. There was no triumph in them, no desire to twist the knife. If anything, there was a hint of sadness, of tired resignation from someone who had faced similar judgments too many times before. The bell above the door chimed one final time as Marla stepped back onto Madison Avenue. The winter sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. She took a deep breath of the cold air, letting it fill her lungs. Behind her, through the store window, she could hear Harold's voice taking on a different tone as he addressed Sandra. But she didn't stay to listen. Some lessons were better learned in private. She walked home slowly, thinking about the interaction, about how some things never seemed to change no matter how many years passed. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Tiffany. Can't wait to talk tonight, Mom. You're the strongest person I know. Away. Marla smiled at the serendipitous timing. Sometimes the universe had a way of providing exactly what you needed, exactly when you needed it. She typed back quickly. And you're the best thing that ever happened to me. Talk soon, baby girl. The doorman held the door for her as she returned to her building. Everything okay, Mrs. Maples? You look a little tired. Everything's fine, Jerry. Just another day in New York. She managed a small smile. And, please, call me Marla. In her apartment, she hung up her coat and made herself a cup of tea. The afternoon sun painted the walls gold, and somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing. Another day, another reminder that no matter how far you've come, some battles never really end. But that was okay. She'd learned long ago that true worth wasn't measured in carats or dollar signs. It was measured in the strength it took to keep your dignity intact, to stay kind in the face of judgment, and to remember that everyone, even those who hurt you, was fighting their own battles. She took her tea to the window, watching the city go about its business below. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance to face the world with grace and resilience. And maybe, just maybe, someone would learn something valuable from today's encounter. After all, that's how change happens. One person, one moment, one lesson at a time. Harold Cartwright III had been in the jewelry business for over 4 decades. He'd learned the trade from his father, who learned it from his father before him. The family joke was that the Cartwrights could identify a genuine gemstone while still in diapers. That Tuesday morning, he sat in his office, examining a particularly fine sapphire under his loupe. The stone's color was exceptional, a deep royal blue that seemed to hold the ocean in its depths. But something wasn't quite right about the clarity. He made a note to have it examined more thoroughly before making an offer. Through his partially open door, he could hear Sandra's voice carrying from the showroom. She was one of their newer hires, brilliant at handling their regular wealthy clientele, but sometimes lacking in the subtle art of reading people accurately. Harold had been meaning to have a talk with her about that. These are our more accessible options, he heard her say, in that tone that made him wince internally. He set down the loupe, listening more carefully now. Something about the other voice in the conversation tugged at his memory. It was gentle, warm, with a hint of a southern accent that years in New York hadn't quite erased. Actually, the voice said, I was thinking of something more along the lines of that sapphire pendant. Harold's head snapped up. He knew that voice. How could he not? He'd spent years helping its owner select some of the finest pieces in his collection. Robert, he called to his assistant. Who's out there with Sandra? Robert, a young man with carefully styled hair and impeccable taste in suits, peered through the doorway. Middle-aged woman, blonde, very well put together, but not flashy. Sandra's trying to steer her toward the lower-end pieces. Harold felt his stomach sink. Does she look familiar to you? Robert squinted. Now that you mention it, wait, is that Marla Maples? Harold finished, already rising from his desk. And Sandra's trying to sell her costume jewelry. Oh, God, Robert whispered, understanding the magnitude of the situation. Should I? No, I'll handle this. Harold straightened his tie, a habit born of decades in luxury retail. But do me a favor. Pull up Miss Maple's purchase history in our system. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with here. As Harold moved toward his office door, he could hear Sandra's voice again, that subtle edge of condescension becoming clearer. As I mentioned, that piece is quite expensive. Perhaps we could look at something more realistic for your situation. Robert was already at the computer, fingers flying over the keyboard. Mr. Cartwright, you need to see this. Miss Maple's purchase history, the numbers are. Harold glanced at the screen and felt his professional composure crack slightly. There it was, in black and white, a history of purchases that would make most of their regular clients blush. The emerald necklace for her daughter alone had been worth more than Sandra's annual salary. Keep that handy, he murmured to Robert. We might need it for a teaching moment. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of his office. Is that Marla Maples I hear out there? The scene that greeted him was exactly what he'd feared. Sandra stood behind the counter with that slightly superior expression she sometimes wore. With clients she'd misjudged, while Marla Maples, actress, television personality, and former wife of one of New York's most famous residents, stood quietly examining a display case. Miss Maples, he said warmly, moving forward with practiced ease. What an absolute pleasure to see you again. That emerald piece we designed for your daughter's graduation, I still tell people about it. He watched as Sandra's expression shifted from professional disdain to confusion, then to dawning horror as recognition set in. Her hands, which had been dismissively arranging items in a display case, suddenly froze. Harold, Marla smiled, and he was struck by how little she'd changed. Still that same warmth, that genuine kindness that had always set her apart from many of their other high-profile clients. It's been too long. Far too long, he agreed, watching from the corner of his eye as Sandra seemed to shrink behind the counter. Robert, could you bring us some refreshments? Miss Maples, please, have a seat. He gestured to their private consultation area, a cozy arrangement of elegant chairs where their most valued clients were typically entertained. Oh, that's not necessary, Marla began, but Harold was already guiding her to the seating area. I insist. We have that wonderful tea you used to enjoy, Jasmine Pearl, isn't it? And I'd love to hear about Tiffany's law school graduation. The photos in the society pages didn't do it justice, I'm sure. Robert appeared with a silver tea service, his movements precise and practiced. Sandra remained frozen behind the counter, looking as though she'd just swallowed something extremely unpleasant. Sandra, Harold called, his tone pleasant but firm. Would you be kind enough to bring over the sapphire pendant Miss Maples was interested in? And perhaps the matching earrings from the vault? Yes, Mr. Cartwright. Sandra's voice was barely above a whisper. Her hands trembled slightly as she removed the pendant from the display case. As Sandra disappeared into the vault to retrieve the earrings, Harold turned back to Marla. You know, we just received a stunning Art Deco emerald ring that made me think of you. The setting is quite similar to that cocktail ring we helped you select for the Met Gala in '97. Marla's eyes lit up with recognition. The one with the calibre-cut diamonds? That was such a beautiful piece. I ended up donating it to that charity auction for children's literacy. Of course you did, Harold smiled, remembering now. That had always been Marla's way, using her privilege to help others whenever she could. Your generosity was always remarkable. Sandra returned with the earrings, setting them carefully on the velvet display pad. Her movements were mechanical, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Thank you, Sandra, Harold said pointedly. Perhaps you'd like to show Miss Maples how beautifully these pieces complement each other. Sandra cleared her throat. Of course, the sapphire pendant features a 5.8-carat cashmere sapphire, surrounded by. Her voice trailed off as she realized Marla probably knew more about fine jewelry than she did. The color is exceptional, Marla noted kindly, trying to ease the younger woman's obvious discomfort. Natural stones with this depth of color are increasingly rare. Harold watched the interaction with interest. Where many clients might have taken this moment to exact revenge for the earlier dismissive treatment, Marla was showing grace. It was a quality he remembered well from her previous visits to the store. "Sandra," he said, keeping his tone casual, "did you know that Miss Maples helped us establish our custom design department? That emerald necklace we created for her daughter became something of a signature piece for us." Sandra's face, already pale, seemed to lose another shade of color. I didn't know that." "Oh, Harold, that was ages ago," Marla demurred. "I just had a vision, and your artisans brought it to life beautifully." "You're too modest," Harold insisted. "Your eye for design was always exceptional. In fact—" He turned to Robert, who had been hovering nearby. "Robert, would you bring out the portfolio from the late 90s? I believe we still have the original sketches." As Robert hurried off, Harold continued, "We used to keep detailed records of all our custom pieces. Still do, actually. It's fascinating to look back and see how styles have evolved." Sandra stood awkwardly, clearly unsure of her role in this conversation. The contrast between her earlier dismissive attitude and her current discomfort was stark. Robert returned with a large leather portfolio, which Harold opened carefully. "Ah, here we are, spring of '98. Look at these designs, Sandra. Miss Maples worked directly with our designers to create pieces that combined classic elegance with modern wearability." Sandra leaned forward despite herself, genuinely impressed by the sketches. "These are beautiful," she admitted softly. "The key," Marla said gently, "is understanding that jewelry isn't just about the price tag or the carats. It's about creating something that makes the wearer feel beautiful, confident, special. Every piece tells a story." Harold watched as Sandra's expression shifted from embarrassment to something approaching understanding. It was the kind of lesson he'd been trying to teach her for months, that true luxury wasn't about exclusion or judgment, but about creating moments of joy and connection. "Miss Maples," Sandra began hesitantly, about earlier." But Marla held up a hand. "Please," she said softly, "let's just look at these beautiful pieces together." The next hour passed in a blur of stories and memories as Harold shared tales from the store's history. He watched as Sandra gradually began to relax, her genuine interest in jewelry and design overcoming her mortification. "Remember the time that Saudi prince came in wanting to buy every piece in the front window?" Harold chuckled. "And you convinced him to make a more curated selection instead?" Marla laughed. "He was about to spend a fortune on pieces that didn't work together at all. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is help someone refine their choices." Sandra, who had been listening intently, ventured a question. "How? How did you learn so much about jewelry?" "The same way anyone learns anything worth knowing," Marla replied. "By making mistakes, by listening to experts, and by remembering that everyone has something to teach you if you're willing to learn." The afternoon light was beginning to fade when Marla finally rose to leave. "This has been lovely, Harold, but I should go. My daughter's calling tonight. And I never miss our calls, if I can help it." Of course. Harold stood as well. "But the sapphire pendant—" Marla glanced at the beautiful piece, still lying on its velvet pad. "Perhaps another time. Today has given me plenty to think about." As she gathered her things, Harold noticed Sandra step forward slightly, then hesitate. The younger woman's face was a study in conflicting emotions: shame, respect, and something that looked like the beginning of understanding. "Miss Maples," Sandra said quietly, "thank you for sharing your knowledge today." Marla smiled, that warm, genuine smile that had always set her apart from many of their other high-profile clients. "Thank you for listening. Sometimes that's all it takes, just being willing to listen and learn." As the door closed behind Marla, the bell chiming softly, Harold turned to Sandra. The teaching moment he'd been planning suddenly seemed unnecessary. Sometimes the best lessons were the ones that life presented unexpectedly. "Mr. Cartwright," Sandra began, her voice unsteady, "I am so sorry. I had no idea." "No," he agreed quietly. "You didn't. But that's not the real problem, is it?" Sandra looked at him questioningly. "The real problem," he continued gently, "is that you thought you did. Remember that, Sandra. It might be the most valuable lesson you learn in this business." The showroom was quiet now, the late afternoon sun catching the diamonds and creating tiny rainbows across the walls. In the silence, the weight of the day's events seemed to settle over everything like a fine dust. Robert, who had witnessed much of the afternoon's drama, approached with a stack of papers in his hand. "Should I pull up Miss Maple's full purchase history? For training purposes?" Harold shook his head. "No need. I think the lesson has been learned." He turned back to Sandra, who was still standing by the counter looking thoughtful. "Hasn't it?" Sandra nodded slowly, her expression suggesting that she was seeing not just the store, but perhaps her entire approach to her work, in a new light. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think it has." After closing time, Sandra stayed behind to help Robert reorganize the display cases. Her movements were mechanical, her mind still replaying every moment of her interaction with Marla Maples. "I can't believe I was so," she trailed off, unable to find the right word. "Judgmental?" Robert supplied, not unkindly. "We've all done it, Sandra. The trick is learning from it." "But I was worse than judgmental. I was cruel." She picked up the sapphire pendant, the one Marla had admired, and carefully placed it back in its display. "And she was so gracious about it. That almost makes it worse." Harold emerged from his office, his coat over his arm. "Still here? Both of you should head home. It's been quite a day." Sandra looked up at him. "Mr. Cartwright, I need to ask. Why didn't you stop me earlier? You must have heard how I was treating her." Harold considered the question carefully. "Sometimes the most valuable lessons are the ones we learn the hard way. Tell me, what did you learn today?" Sandra set down the cleaning cloth she'd been holding. "That I was wrong. Not just about Miss Maples, but about how I've been approaching this job. I've been so focused on looking for the right kind of customer that I forgot to look for the right kind of person." "And what's the difference?" Harold prompted. "The right kind of customer is about money, about status. The right kind of person." She paused, thinking of Marla's gentle smile, her patience, her kindness, even in the face of rudeness. The right kind of person is about character. Robert whistled softly. "Now that's what I call a revelation." "Indeed." Harold nodded. "You know, in all the years Marla Maples shopped here, she never once demanded special treatment. Never pulled rank, never threw her name around. Even when she was at the height of her fame, or notoriety, depending on who you asked, she was always just herself." Sandra felt tears pricking at her eyes. "I need to apologize to her properly, not just that fumbling attempt I made today." "You'll have your chance," Harold said, pulling on his coat. "Something tells me we haven't seen the last of Miss Maples." As they locked up the store, Sandra looked at her reflection in the darkened window. She saw herself differently now, not just as a sales associate at an exclusive jewelry store, but as someone who had been given an important lesson in humanity. The streetlights were coming on along Madison Avenue, and the early evening crowd was heading home from work. Sandra thought about Marla, probably at home now, talking to her daughter on the phone. She thought about all the assumptions she'd made, all the judgments she'd passed, not just today, but every day. "You know what the worst part is?" she said to Robert as they waited for their respective Ubers. "I bet I'm not the first person to treat her that way. Can you imagine dealing with that kind of prejudice day after day?" Robert squeezed her shoulder. "The important thing is that you recognize it now. That's the first step to being better." As Sandra climbed into her Uber, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Harold. "Sandra, attached is an article from 1996 about Miss Maple's charity work with children's literacy programs. I thought you might find it interesting. Tomorrow, let's talk about how we can do better. Harold." She clicked on the attachment and began to read, her heart growing heavier with each paragraph describing Marla's dedication to helping underprivileged children learn to read. The woman she had dismissed so casually had spent years working tirelessly to make a difference in children's lives. The car wound its way through the city streets, and Sandra made a promise to herself. Tomorrow would be different. She would be different. Because sometimes the most valuable things in life weren't the ones locked in glass cases. They were the lessons that changed who you were as a person. And Marla Maples, without meaning to, had taught her one of the most valuable lessons of all. The next morning dawned cold and bright over Madison Avenue. Sandra arrived at Cartwright & Sons an hour early, something she'd never done before. She needed time to think, to prepare herself for the day ahead. "You're here early," Robert commented, finding her already arranging displays. "Still thinking about yesterday?" I barely slept, Sandra admitted, adjusting a diamond tennis bracelet with trembling hands. I kept thinking about what Mr. Cartwright said, about how Maples never demanded special treatment. And here I was, treating her like she didn't deserve basic respect. Robert leaned against the counter. You know what I remember about her? Back when I first started here as an intern, she came in one Christmas Eve, right before closing. But instead of rushing us to help her, she brought cookies for the staff. Said nobody should work holidays without something sweet to keep them going. Sandra felt her chest tighten. That makes it even worse. The morning passed in a blur of regular customers, the usual parade of wealthy Upper East Siders and tourists with platinum cards. Sandra found herself watching each interaction more carefully now, questioning her own assumptions, trying to see beyond the surface. Around noon, the bell above the door chimed. Sandra looked up and her heart nearly stopped. Marla Maples stood in the doorway, snowflakes melting in her hair. Miss Maples, Sandra breathed, her prepared speech dying in her throat. Hello, Sandra. Marla's voice was gentle, but there was something in her eyes. A weariness that hadn't been there yesterday. He's with another client, but... Sandra gathered her courage. Could we talk? Please? Marla seemed to consider this for a moment, then nodded. Of course. Sandra led her to the private consultation area, her hands shaking as she prepared to make tea. She knocked over a cup, catching it just before it fell. Here, let me help, Marla offered, reaching for the teapot. No, please, Sandra said quickly. Let me do this. I need to do this. They sat in silence as Sandra prepared the tea, each movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. Finally, she took a deep breath. Miss Maples, about yesterday. Sandra, Marla interrupted gently. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Sandra's voice cracked slightly. What I did, how I treated you, it wasn't just unprofessional, it was cruel. And I need you to know that I see that now. Marla wrapped her hands around her teacup, studying the younger woman's face. Why did you do it? The question wasn't accusatory. If anything, it held genuine curiosity. That somehow made it harder to answer. Because, Sandra felt tears threatening. Because I thought I knew who you were. I looked at your bag, your clothes, and I made assumptions. I've been doing this job for 3 years, and I thought I could spot real money, real status. I was so sure I knew everything. And now? Now I realize I know nothing. Worse than nothing. I've probably been wrong about so many people, hurt so many people, and never even realized it. Marla was quiet for a moment, sipping her tea. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. You know what hurts the most? It's not the dismissal. Not really. I've dealt with that my whole life. Before, during, and after my marriage. It's the fact that no matter what I do, no matter how I live my life, some people will always see me as just one thing: Trump's ex-wife. Sandra felt her face burn with shame. I didn't even see you as that. I didn't recognize you at all. I just saw someone you thought wasn't good enough, Marla finished. Someone who didn't belong in your world. Yes, Sandra whispered. The admission painful but necessary. You know, I was a waitress in Georgia before all this. Did you know that? Marla's eyes took on a distant look. I worked double shifts, lived in a tiny apartment, dreamed of making it big in New York. And when I finally got here, you know what I discovered? That success, real success, isn't about what you own or who knows your name. It's about how you treat people when nobody's watching. Sandra wiped a tear from her cheek. I read the article Mr. Cartwright sent me, about your work with children's literacy. Those kids? Marla smiled, genuine warmth lighting up her face. They don't care about designer labels or society pages. They just want someone to believe in them, to show them they matter. Like you did with me yesterday, Sandra realized. You could have humiliated me, reported me to Mr. Cartwright. Instead, you showed grace. Because humiliating you wouldn't have changed anything. It would have just added more negativity to the world. Marla set down her teacup. We all make mistakes, Sandra. The question is, what do we learn from them? The store had grown busier around them, other customers browsing the cases, Robert and Harold helping clients. But in their quiet corner, Something important was happening. A transformation. A recognition of shared humanity. I used to think this job was about selling jewelry, Sandra said slowly. But it's not, is it? It's about being part of people's stories, their special moments. Exactly. Marla reached into her bag and pulled out an old photograph. See this? This was me, 25 years ago, right after I'd gotten my first big break in New York. I was so proud of buying my first piece of real jewelry. It wasn't expensive, but it made me feel like I belonged. Sandra studied the photo. A younger Marla, beaming at the camera, wearing a simple gold pendant. You looked so happy. I was. Because someone at that jewelry store treated me like I mattered, even though I was just a struggling actress with barely enough money for the piece. They saw me as a person, not a price tag. The bell chimed again as more customers entered. Sandra glanced up, then back at Marla. I should probably go, Marla smiled. Help your customers, but remember what we talked about. Sandra stood, smoothing her skirt. Miss Maples. Call me Marla. After this conversation, I think we're beyond formalities. Marla, thank you. Not just for forgiving me, but for teaching me. Thank you for being willing to learn. Marla gathered her things. You know, I did really like that sapphire pendant. It's still here, Sandra said quickly. I could show it to you again. Maybe another time. Marla touched Sandra's arm gently. When the moment is right. As Marla headed toward the door, Sandra called after her. How will I know? When the moment is right? Marla turned back, a knowing smile on her face. When you stop seeing it as a sale and start seeing it as part of someone's story. The door chimed as Marla left, the sound somehow different than it had been yesterday. Sandra stood for a moment, watching her disappear into the crowd on Madison Avenue. Robert appeared at her side. Everything okay? Sandra touched the teacup Marla had used, still warm. No, she said thoughtfully. Everything's different, and that's exactly as it should be. She turned to help a young couple who had just walked in, students, by the look of their clothes, probably shopping for an engagement ring. Yesterday, she might have dismissed them. Today, she saw something else. A story waiting to be told. Welcome to Cartwright & Sons, she said warmly. How can I help make your special moment perfect? The rest of the day passed in a blur of customers and conversations, but something had shifted. Each interaction felt different now, charged with new meaning and possibility. Sandra found herself really listening to people's stories, seeing beyond the surface to the dreams and hopes that brought them through the door. That evening, as she was closing up, Harold appeared from his office. I saw Marla Maples came back today, he said casually. She did. Sandra was quiet for a moment. She taught me more in 2 conversations than I've learned in 3 years of selling jewelry. Harold smiled. Sometimes the most valuable things in life aren't the ones we keep in these cases. I know that now. Sandra locked the final display case. I really know that now. Outside, the city was coming alive with evening energy. Sandra stood for a moment, watching the parade of humanity along Madison Avenue, the tourists and locals, the wealthy and the dreamers, each person carrying their own story. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance to put these lessons into practice. And somewhere out there, Marla Maples was going about her life, probably unaware of just how profound an impact she'd had on a jewelry store saleswoman who had once dismissed her without a second thought. But that was the thing about true grace. It changed people in ways that rippled outward, touching lives far beyond the original moment. Sandra knew she would never be the same. And for that, she was profoundly grateful. Later that night, Sandra sat at her small kitchen table in her Upper West Side apartment, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold beside her. Her laptop was open to an article about Marla Maples' charity work, one of many she'd been reading since getting home. Her phone buzzed with a text from Robert. You okay? Today was intense. She typed back. Learning a lot about myself, not all of it good. 3 dots appeared then. Growth isn't supposed to be comfortable. See you tomorrow? Yeah. Thanks, Robert. She closed her laptop and walked to the window. The city lights twinkled below, millions of stories playing out in apartments just like hers. How many times had she judged those stories without knowing them? How many people had she dismissed, categorized, written off? Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her mother. Hi, Mom. she answered, suddenly needing to hear a familiar voice. Sandra, you sound tired, honey. I am. Mom, did I ever tell you about my first job interview in New York? At that coffee shop? Yeah, I was so nervous, wearing that second-hand blazer we found at Goodwill. The manager took one look at me and said they weren't hiring, but they had a help wanted sign in the window. Her mother was quiet for a moment. I remember how upset you were. I was thinking about that today. About how it felt to be judged, to be found wanting. And, Mom, I think I've become that manager. Oh, sweetheart. No, it's good that I see it now. I wish I'd seen it sooner. They talked for a while longer, about growth and mistakes and learning. When Sandra finally hung up, she felt lighter somehow. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance to be better. She picked up her journal, something she hadn't written in for months, and began to write. Today I learned what real grace looks like. It looks like Marla Maples, sitting across from me with kindness in her eyes, teaching me about humanity when I had shown her none. It looks like second chances, and quiet wisdom, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself. The words flowed onto the page, a testimony to transformation, to the power of moments that change us forever. Outside her window, New York continued its endless dance of lights and shadows, of stories intersecting in ways that would never be known. And somewhere in this vast city, Marla Maples was probably getting ready for bed, unaware that her gesture of grace had set in motion changes that would ripple out in ways she might never see. But isn't that how the best changes happen? Not with fanfare and declaration, but in quiet moments of recognition, in the gentle unfolding of understanding. Sandra closed her journal and finally went to bed. Tomorrow would bring new customers, new stories, new chances to prove that she had learned from this moment. And she was ready. Ready to see people, really see them, beyond the labels and assumptions that had once seemed so important. Because in the end, that's what Marla had taught her, that the true value of a person could never be measured in carats or dollars, but in the capacity to show kindness even when it hasn't been earned. And that was a lesson worth more than all the jewels in Cartwright and Sons cases combined. 3 months passed like a turning page. Spring arrived in New York, bringing with it that particular energy that makes everything feel possible. At Cartwright and Sons, the window displays had changed to reflect the season. Lighter pieces, more colored stones, designs that spoke of renewal. Sandra stood behind the counter, helping an elderly gentleman choose a gift for his granddaughter's college graduation. Her approach was different now, gentler, more patient. She listened as he told stories about his granddaughter's achievements, her dreams of medical school, her volunteer work at local clinics. She sounds remarkable, Sandra said warmly, bringing out a selection of pieces she thought might resonate with the stories she'd just heard. These aren't just graduation gifts, they're symbols of her journey. Robert, arranging displays nearby, smiled to himself. The change in Sandra over the past 3 months had been remarkable. Gone was the subtle condescension, the quick judgments. In their place was genuine interest, real connection. I like this one, the gentleman said, pointing to a delicate pendant with a small but perfect sapphire. It reminds me of her eyes. It's beautiful, Sandra agreed. And look how the setting allows light to pass through from all angles, rather like your granddaughter's desire to see all sides of a situation. You mentioned her interest in holistic medicine? As she wrapped the chosen piece, the bell above the door chimed. Sandra looked up, and her heart skipped a beat. Marla Maples stood in the doorway, sunlight streaming in behind her. Just a moment, Sandra called out, her voice carrying a slight tremor. She finished wrapping the gentleman's purchase with care, including a handwritten note about the symbolism of sapphires and their connection to wisdom and healing. After the customer left, Sandra turned to face Marla. 3 months had passed since their last conversation, but the lessons of that day remained fresh in her mind. "Welcome back," Sandra said softly. Marla smiled, moving toward the counter. "I was in the neighborhood and thought." She paused, studying Sandra's face. "You look different." "I feel different," Sandra admitted. "Every day since you were last here, I've tried to remember what you taught me." "Oh?" Marla set her bag down, genuinely curious. "And what was that?" "That every person who walks through that door is exactly that, a person. Not a price tag, not a handbag, not a headline. Sandra's voice grew stronger. I wrote those words down the day you said them. They're taped to my mirror at home now. Robert approached, carrying a tray of fresh tea. Miss Maples, it's wonderful to see you again. The usual jasmine pearl? You remember? Marla said, touched. Some things are worth remembering, Robert replied, with a meaningful glance at Sandra. As he prepared the tea, Sandra gathered her courage. Would you like to see how we've rearranged the collections? We've created themed displays based on stories now, not just price points. Marla's eyes lit up with interest. Show me. Sandra led her to the first display case. This collection is called New Beginnings. Each piece is selected for someone starting a new chapter, graduation, career change, personal transformation. We help customers choose pieces that reflect their journey, not just their budget. That's different, Marla observed, noting how the pieces were arranged to tell a story rather than showcase their monetary value. You inspired it, actually, Sandra admitted. After our conversation, I suggested to Mr. Cartwright that we try a new approach. He was surprisingly enthusiastic. More than enthusiastic, Harold's voice came from behind them. He'd emerged from his office, smiling warmly. Sandra's new approach has increased our sales by 20%. But more importantly, we're building real relationships with our clients. Marla turned to Sandra. Tell me more about these changes. They moved from case to case, Sandra explaining how each collection was curated around themes of life's important moments. As they walked, she shared stories of customers who had connected with pieces in unexpected ways. Last week, a woman came in looking for something expensive enough to wear to her ex-husband's wedding, Sandra recalled. But after we talked, really talked, she chose this instead. She pointed to a simple but elegant gold bracelet. She said it represented her own strength, not what others expected of her. Marla touched the glass gently. That's beautiful, Sandra. Not just the jewelry, the understanding. They reached the final display case, and Sandra took a deep breath. And this is my favorite collection. We call it Grace. In the case lay several pieces, including the sapphire pendant Marla had admired 3 months ago. But now, it was displayed differently, surrounded by smaller pieces that complemented its beauty without competing with it. The sapphire pendant is the centerpiece, Sandra explained, her voice soft. But look how it connects with these other pieces. They're like moments in a life, some grand, some simple, but all valuable, all part of the story. Marla was quiet for a moment, studying the display. You've really thought about this. I think about it every day, Sandra admitted. About how I used to see only the surface of things. About how much I was missing. Harold cleared his throat. Sandra, why don't you show Miss Maples the new private viewing room? I think she'd be interested in the changes we've made there as well. The private viewing room had been transformed. Instead of the austere luxury it once projected, it now felt warm and inviting. Photos on the walls showed clients wearing their pieces at special moments, graduations, weddings, anniversaries. Each photo was accompanied by a small story. We ask clients if they're willing to share their stories, Sandra explained. Not everyone does, but those who do. It helps others see that jewelry isn't just about wealth or status. It's about marking moments that matter. Marla sat down, taking it all in. This is quite a change from 3 months ago. Everything's different now, Sandra said quietly. I'm different now, and I have you to thank for that. Me? Marla shook her head. I didn't do anything except be myself. Exactly. Sandra's voice caught slightly. You showed me what real grace looks like. Not by preaching about it, but by demonstrating it when I least deserved it. A young couple appeared in the doorway, looking uncertain. 3 months ago, Sandra might have assessed their clothes, their watches, their potential to afford the store's pieces. Now, she saw something else. Their nervous excitement, their hopeful expressions. Would you excuse me for a moment? She asked Marla. I think someone needs help starting their story. Marla watched as Sandra approached the couple, her manner warm and welcoming. There was no trace of the judgment that had been so evident 3 months ago. Beautiful, isn't it? Harold said quietly, having appeared beside Marla's chair. Not the jewelry, though that is lovely. I mean the transformation. She did all the hard work herself, Marla observed. Perhaps. But sometimes, people need a mirror to see themselves clearly. You provided that mirror, Miss Maples. They watched as Sandra listened to the couple's story. They were medical residents, looking for a small but meaningful piece to celebrate matching at the same hospital for their residencies. You know, Harold continued, in 40 years of selling jewelry, I've learned that the most valuable things we possess aren't the ones we keep in our cases. No, Marla agreed, watching Sandra's genuine smile as she shared the young couple's joy. The most valuable things are the moments when we choose to be better than our circumstances require us to be. Sandra led the couple to the New Beginnings collection, her whole manner radiating genuine interest in their story. Through the store's windows, spring sunlight caught the diamonds and created tiny rainbows that danced across the walls. I should go, Marla said, gathering her things. But I'm glad I came back. The sapphire pendant is still here, Harold mentioned casually. If you're interested, Marla smiled. Maybe another time. Today I got something much more valuable. As she headed toward the door, Sandra looked up from her customers. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something profound passed between them. An acknowledgement of how a single interaction, handled with grace, could change not just two people, but an entire way of being in the world. The bell chimed as Marla left, its sound merging with the busy symphony of Madison Avenue. Inside Cartwright & Sons, Sandra turned back to her customers, ready to help them find the perfect piece to mark their moment. Because that's what she did now. She helped people tell their stories, one precious piece at a time. And her own story, forever changed by a chance encounter with Marla Maples, had become part of the store's legacy, a testament to the transformative power of grace, understanding, and the courage to change. That evening, after the store had closed, Sandra sat in the private viewing room, looking at the wall of photos and stories. She'd started keeping a journal of special moments, not sales figures or commission totals, but real human connections that happened in the store. Robert found her there, flipping through the pages. Still here? He asked, leaning against the doorframe. Just thinking, she replied. Remember that couple from last week, the one celebrating their 50th anniversary? The ones where the husband wanted to recreate her original engagement ring that they'd had to sell during hard times? Sandra nodded. I keep thinking about how they looked at each other when he gave it to her. That's what this job is really about, isn't it? Not the jewelry, the moments. You've come a long way from, these might be more in your price range, Robert teased gently. God, I was awful, wasn't I? Sandra closed her journal. How did you all put up with me? Because we could see who you could become. Just like you see it in others now. Harold appeared in the doorway, coat in hand. Staying late again, you two? Just finishing up, Sandra said, standing. Mr. Cartwright, thank you for not firing me that day. Why would I fire my best sales associate? I was terrible that day with Miss Maples. Yes, Harold agreed. But terrible moments don't make terrible people. It's what we learn from them that matters. As they walked out together, the evening light was turning the city golden. Sandra paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the store's elegant facade. You know what I realized today, she said. When Miss Maples came in 3 months ago, I thought I was the one with the power to judge, to dismiss, to determine someone's worth. But she was the powerful one all along. Because true power isn't about making people feel small. It's about having the ability to hurt someone and choosing not to. Harold locked the door, the familiar click echoing in the evening air. That's quite an insight. I have her to thank for it. Sandra adjusted her bag on her shoulder. All of this really, the new displays, the story collections, the way we really listen to customers now. It all started because she chose to teach rather than punish. And what will you do with that lesson? Harold asked. Sandra thought about the young medical residents she'd helped today, about how their faces lit up when they found the perfect piece to mark their achievement. She thought about all the customers yet to come, all the stories yet to be told. Pass it on, she said simply. Every day, every customer, every chance I get. They parted ways on the corner, each heading to their own part of the city. But before Sandra turned toward the subway, she looked back at the store one last time. In the window, the Grace collection caught the last rays of sunlight, the sapphire pendant at its center throwing blue fire across the display. She thought about Marla Maples, who had walked away without buying anything but had given everyone in the store something priceless instead. She thought about how a single moment of grace could ripple outward, touching lives in ways that might never be fully known. And she made a promise to herself, there on that busy New York street corner, that she would honor that gift by passing it on, one interaction at a time, one story at a time, one moment of grace at a time. Because in the end, that's what life was really about. Not the jewelry we wear or the labels we carry, but the way we treat each other when it matters most. And Marla Maples, without meaning to, had taught her that the most precious things in life couldn't be kept in a display case or wrapped in elegant boxes. They could only be held in the heart, where they shone brighter than any diamond, more valuable than any gem, marking the moments when we choose to be our best selves, even when, especially when, others are not at their best with us. And that was a lesson worth more than all the jewels in the world.